In the quiet hum of a candlelit room, Eleanor Langley sat alone, the amber glow casting gentle shadows over the page before her. Her pen trembled slightly in her fingers, though her words flowed with careful deliberation. She was writing her fifth response to an advertisement from the Frontier Matrimonial Gazette, a service that paired women from the cities with men in the remote, often lonely towns of the American Northwest. Eleanor was not the kind of woman the Gazette usually featured. At nearly 6 feet tall and broad in frame, she was often described kindly or otherwise as sturdy. Her mother, before passing, had always encouraged her to wait for someone who would see past appearances. But at 29, and with little left of her family fortune after the war, Eleanor had grown tired of waiting. This latest letter was addressed to a man named Thomas Callahan, a lumberjack in the town of Bear Ridge, Montana. His AD had been different. He didn't describe the physical traits he wanted in a bride, not exactly. He wrote of someone strong in spirit and generous in heart. Someone who doesn't wilt in the face of snow or silence. Eleanor had read his ad a dozen times before daring to reply. Bear Ridge was nothing like Boston. She arrived weeks later after an arduous train ride followed by a bone-jarring carriage journey through thick pines and winding dirt roads. When she stepped down from the wagon, her boots crunched against fresh snow. The air was colder than she expected. Drier too. The small group of townsfolk gathered at the edge of the depot greeted her with curious eyes and tight smiles. There was no sign of Thomas Callahan. Instead, a short, sharp-featured woman approached her. "Miss Langley?" she asked, eyeing her up and down. "Yes," Eleanor replied, setting down her heavy trunk. "I'm Mrs. Weatherby. I handle introductions here on behalf of the Gazette. I regret to inform you." She paused, awkwardly. "Mr. Callahan has declined the match." The words struck harder than the cold ever could. "I beg your pardon?" Eleanor asked, stiffening. Mrs. Weatherby looked uncomfortable. "He saw your photograph. Said you weren't what he expected." Eleanor flushed, not with embarrassment, but with rising anger. "He's never even met me." "I'm sorry," the woman said, her tone final. "There's a carriage leaving in 3 days. Until then, the inn will put you up. Good day." Eleanor stood there, her breath fogging in the crisp air, chest tight, heart heavier than her trunk. She had come all this way, dared to hope again, only to be rejected without even a word to her face. The inn was simple, but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of pine wood and coffee floated in the air. Eleanor spent the first day in silence, staring out the frosted window, watching people pass by, always in pairs or small groups. She felt larger than ever, out of place in a town that seemed built for smaller, quieter lives. But on the second day, someone knocked on her door. When she opened it, she expected the innkeeper, or perhaps Mrs. Weatherby, with more uncomfortable words. Instead, a towering man stood before her, bundled in a thick wool coat, snow dusting his dark beard. His eyes were a striking gray, steady and curious. "You're Eleanor Langley?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. I'm Matthew Burke," he said, offering a hand. "I work with Thomas Callahan. I heard what happened." Eleanor stared at the offered hand, then slowly shook it. His grip was firm, but gentle. He didn't flinch or frown at her size. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thomas is, well, he's not a bad man, but he's blind in ways that matter." Eleanor lifted her chin. "I didn't come here for pity, Mr. Burke." He smiled. "Good, because I'm not offering it." That was the moment. Something shifted, barely a flicker, but it was there. A spark. He didn't avert his eyes or look past her. He saw her, and he wasn't turning away. The morning after Matthew Burke's unexpected visit, Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of Bear Ridge, unsure of her next step. Her trunk was still packed at the inn, and her ticket for the return journey sat folded beneath her pillow. She had 2 more days before the carriage would take her back east, back to uncertainty, back to the quiet loneliness she thought she'd left behind. But something about Matthew's visit lingered, his voice, his eyes, the way he said he wasn't offering pity, and how she believed him. So when she stepped out and found him waiting by the porch with a steaming tin mug in hand, she wasn't surprised. She was cautious, yes, but not surprised. "Coffee?" he asked, holding the mug toward her. "I suppose I could use some," she replied, stepping into the cold. Matthew gestured toward the trail that led into the woods. "Walk with me." She hesitated, then nodded. "Just a short one." The pine trees stretched tall and straight as cathedral columns, their snow-laden branches whispering overhead. The path was narrow but firm beneath their boots. They walked, in companionable silence at first, the crunch of snow, the only sound between them. Matthew finally spoke. "You're different than I expected." Eleanor's breath hitched, but she kept walking. "Is that so?" "Not in a bad way," he added quickly. "I mean, most folks who come out here are either desperate or running from something." She gave a small, dry laugh. "And you think I'm neither?" He glanced at her sideways. "I think you're looking for something." She looked down at her boots. "I was hoping to find someone who might see me as more than what people usually see." Matthew stopped walking. She turned to look at him. "I do," he said, his tone quiet but sure. "I see a woman who crossed half the country for a chance at something real. That takes courage. And strength." Eleanor blinked, taken aback. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know how Thomas treated you, and I know how you held your head high even after. That tells me a lot." She felt her cheeks flush. This time, not from anger or cold. She wasn't used to compliments, not ones that saw beneath the surface. As they walked deeper into the forest, he spoke more freely. "I came here 7 years ago," he told her. "After my brother died, couldn't stand the noise of the cities anymore. Up here, things are simpler, quiet. You work, you eat, you sleep, and every now and then, you meet someone who reminds you why you keep going." Eleanor tilted her head. "Are you saying I'm that someone?" He smiled softly. "Maybe." It was forward, bold but not unwelcome. Not from him. They reached a clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a frozen lake. The sunlight scattered across the ice, bright and dazzling. Matthew led her to a fallen log, brushing snow off before sitting down. "Do you know why Thomas really turned you down?" he asked, not looking at her. "I thought it was obvious," she said bitterly. "He didn't like the look of me." "That's part of it," Matthew admitted. "But he's also scared of anything he can't control. A woman like you, you'd have run circles around him." She laughed, a full open sound that surprised even herself. "Well," she said, settling beside him on the log. "That's the nicest insult I've ever received." He turned toward her, his eyes kind. It wasn't an insult. They sat, in silence, a moment, watching the light play over the lake. A pair of birds darted past, their wings slicing through the stillness. "I'm not asking for anything," Matthew said. "Not now. I'd like to see you again. Before you go." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, a scar across one brow. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something undeniably compelling about him. Real, steady, good. She nodded slowly. "I'd like that too." Back in her room that evening, Eleanor stood before the mirror. Her reflection hadn't changed. Tall, strong, soft. In all the places society said she shouldn't be. But something about the way she carried herself had shifted. She no longer saw a woman rejected. She saw a woman choosing. And tomorrow, she would choose to walk again deeper into the pines. And perhaps, deeper into something else entirely. The next morning dawned pale and quiet. Snow had fallen overnight, softening the world into a dreamlike hush. Eleanor pulled on her boots with more certainty than the days before. She hadn't yet told the innkeeper she was reconsidering her ticket home, but the thought lingered like a warming ember. When she stepped outside, Matthew was waiting again. This time, he didn't offer her coffee. He simply nodded toward the road. "Thought you might like to see where I work." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "You're taking me to the lumberyard." "Well," he said, smiling slightly, "you did come all this way for a working man? Might as well see what you were signing up for." She laughed, falling into step beside him. "I suppose I deserve that." The lumber camp was a half-mile past the last cabin on the edge of town, nestled in a valley surrounded by timber-laden slopes. The air smelled of pine resin, sawdust, and sweat. Smoke curled from chimneys of small bunkhouses, and men moved about, with axes slung over shoulders and heavy coats dusted in snow. Eleanor watched them as they paused to study her, not rudely, but curiously. A few offered polite nods. One or two gave Matthew knowing looks. She held her chin up, refusing to shrink under the weight of their glances. Matthew led her to a large open shed where logs were being measured and cut for shipping. He explained the work, the rhythm of felling, the dangers of spring-loaded branches, the grueling process of hauling timber by sled. His voice came alive here, grounded by the physicality of the life he lived. "This isn't easy work," he said, picking up an axe and holding it in both hands. "It doesn't care how tired you are, or how lonely, it's just honest." She nodded. "There's beauty in that." He looked at her. There is. They spent hours wandering the camp. She met the foreman, a grizzled man named Pete, who said, "So this is the woman," putting a smile on Burke's face for the first time in years. Eleanor laughed, though Matthew rolled his eyes. They stopped at the mess hall for lunch. Salted pork, beans, and thick slabs of bread served on tin plates. It was nothing like the refined meals Eleanor had grown up with, but it tasted better than anything she'd eaten in months. After lunch, Matthew led her down to the river where they stored logs before sending them downstream in spring. "Why, did you come out here?" he asked suddenly, not looking at her. Eleanor stared at the frozen water. "You mean to Bear Ridge?" He nodded. She took a breath. "Because I was tired of being invisible. Because every time someone saw me, it was never for who I was, just what I looked like. And because I still believe that somewhere out there, there's someone who doesn't just tolerate a woman like me. He wants her." Matthew's jaw tensed, slightly, but not in anger. "You ever been loved, Eleanor?" She hesitated. "Not truly. Not in the way that matters." He nodded slowly. "Me neither." She turned toward him. "But you're kind, solid. People here respect you." He chuckled, low and rough. "That's not the same as love. Respect's easy when you're strong and quiet. Love takes more." They stood there for a while, letting the river whisper beneath the ice. When he finally looked at her, his gaze was steady. "I won't pretend I have much to offer, not like the men back east, but I know how to show up. I know how to work, and I know how to care about something without running from it." Eleanor's voice was soft. "I don't want luxury, Matthew. I want to be seen, chosen." He stepped closer. "Then maybe we want the same thing." That evening, back at the inn, Eleanor didn't touch her return ticket. She placed it in the drawer by her bed, closed it carefully, and then opened her trunk again, not to pack, but to unpack. Piece by piece. She laid her belongings out in the small room. A brush, a hand mirror, a pale blue scarf her mother had once knitted. She smoothed the scarf over the dresser, pausing. She wasn't just passing through anymore. Something was beginning, something real. The days that followed were unlike anything Eleanor had imagined. Each morning, she rose early to the sound of the town stirring wood chopping, horses neighing, and the soft murmur of voices carried on the crisp air. Bear Ridge was awakening, and so was she. Matthew and Eleanor began spending more time together. Not just the occasional walk or lumber camp visit, but true companionship born of shared moments, sometimes silent, sometimes filled with laughter and stories. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself at the edge of a clearing with Matthew. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the snow-dusted ground. "You've been avoiding the town square," Matthew teased, his breath puffing in the cold. Eleanor smiled, brushing snow from her coat sleeve. "I suppose I have. It's easier to stay on the edges than face the stairs." Matthew stepped closer. "You don't need to hide." Her eyes searched his face, wondering if he truly understood. "People here aren't unkind. They're just not used to someone like me." He reached out, taking her hand in his. "Then it's time they get used to you." Word of Eleanor's presence and her growing friendship with Matthew began to spread through Bear Ridge. At first, the town was skeptical. A tall, confident woman who refused to shrink to fit their expectations was unusual in this small, rugged community, but Eleanor was determined to prove she belonged. One morning, she volunteered to help at the general store, organizing supplies and greeting customers. She listened carefully to their stories and shared a few of her own about city life, her mother, and her journey west. Slowly, the townsfolk began to warm to her. Mrs. Weatherby, the matchmaker, even admitted one evening over a shared cup of tea that Eleanor was something special. She had never seen a woman with such determination and grace in Bear Ridge. Meanwhile, Matthew was quietly watching Eleanor's transformation. Her confidence was infectious, and her kindness touched even the most hardened men in town. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the inn's common room, a group of lumberjacks gathered around, sharing tales of their day. Eleanor listened, fascinated by the camaraderie and resilience of the men. Matthew leaned in and said softly, "You fit right in here." She laughed. "I'm still learning, but it feels like home." He smiled, reaching for her hand again. Yet, not all moments were easy. Eleanor faced her share of challenges, a harsh winter storm that knocked out power for days, the sting of whispered doubts from some townspeople, and moments of loneliness, when the weight of being different felt unbearable. But through it all, Matthew stood beside her, unwavering. One night, after the storm had passed, Eleanor found herself standing outside, staring at the clear star-filled sky. Matthew joined her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Why did you stay?" she asked quietly. He looked down at her, eyes sincere. "Because I see you. Not just the surface, but the heart beneath. And because I believe you belong here." Her breath caught. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid no one would ever choose me." He shook his head. "You don't need to be afraid anymore." By the time spring thawed the snow, Eleanor's place in Bear Ridge was secure. She had grown roots where she'd once only dreamed of planting them, and in Matthew's steady presence, she found something she hadn't dared to hope for, the promise of love that sees beyond size, beyond expectation, love that chooses wholeheartedly. Spring had arrived in Bear Ridge with a gentle touch, melting the last of the snow and filling the air with the scent of pine and fresh earth. The town was alive again, buzzing with renewed energy and the promise of new beginnings. For Eleanor, it was a season of change, of growing confidence and deepening bonds. One crisp afternoon, Matthew invited her for a walk deeper into the forest than they had ever ventured. The trail was soft underfoot, carpeted with moss and dotted with wildflowers just beginning to bloom. "This place," Matthew said, pausing beside a cluster of bright blue lupins, "is where I come when I need to think. It's quiet, untouched, and it reminds me what really matters." Eleanor looked around, breathing in the serenity. "It's beautiful," he smiled. "Not as beautiful as someone I know." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm but smiled back. They walked slowly, the easy silence between them speaking volumes. Matthew led her to a small clearing where a wooden bench sat beneath towering pines. It was a place Eleanor hadn't seen before, private and peaceful, with dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. He sat down, patting the space beside him. Eleanor hesitated, then sat close. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Matthew began, his voice steady but tender. "About what you mean to me, what you've brought into my life." Eleanor looked at him, heart pounding. "I know I'm not the kind of man you imagined when you answered Thomas Callahan's ad," he said with a rough chuckle, "but what I can promise is this. I will stand by you. I will respect you. I will cherish you for every part of who you are." Her eyes glistened. "That's all I've ever wanted to hear." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple, hand-carved wooden ring, smoothed and polished with care. "Eleanor Langley, will you marry me?" For a moment, time seemed to pause. The gentle rustling of the forest was the only sound as Eleanor took the ring, her fingers trembling. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy spilling over. Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, and they sat, wrapped in the quiet of the woods. A new chapter unfolding between them, back in Bear Ridge. News of their engagement spread quickly. The townsfolk, who had once been skeptical, now welcomed Eleanor with open arms. She was no longer just the tall, sturdy woman who arrived on the train. She was a part of the community, a beacon of hope and strength. At the general store, Mrs. Weatherby approached Eleanor with a smile. "I must admit, I underestimated you." Eleanor laughed. "You're not the only one." The weeks that followed were filled with preparations and celebrations. Neighbors offered gifts, baked pies, and shared stories of their own journeys to love and acceptance. Eleanor found herself overwhelmed, not by fear, but by gratitude. The journey she had taken, from rejection to acceptance, had been arduous, but every step had been worth it. One evening, as she and Matthew sat by the fire in their shared cabin, Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked softly. Matthew kissed her hair. "I do, but I'm glad they weren't, because I found you, and that's everything." Eleanor smiled, feeling whole for the first time in years. Life in Bear Ridge settled into a comforting rhythm. Eleanor and Matthew's days were filled with the hard work of the lumber camp, community gatherings, and the quiet moments they carved out for themselves. But as the wedding approached, Eleanor found herself wrestling with an unexpected unease. One evening, as the sun dipped below the pine-covered hills, Eleanor sat by the window of their cabin, her fingers tracing the edges of the wooden ring Matthew had carved for her. "Matthew," she began hesitantly, "do you ever wonder if we're rushing?" Matthew looked up from the fire he was stoking, concern flickering in his eyes. "I don't think so." "Why?" Eleanor sighed, the weight of years spent feeling unwanted pressing down on her. "Because I've been rejected before. For my size, my strength. For just being myself. I'm afraid the world will never truly accept me." Matthew crossed the room, sitting beside her and taking her hands in his. "I know the world can be cruel," he said softly. "But here, with me, you're safe, you're loved." She smiled faintly. It's hard to believe that sometimes. In the days that followed, Eleanor faced moments of doubt, the whispers of the few who still eyed her skeptically, the ache of missing the family she'd lost, and the fear that she wasn't enough. One afternoon, while helping at the town's schoolhouse, a group of children asked her why she was so tall and strong. She knelt to their level and smiled. "Because I'm made to be just who I am." Their wide eyes reflected admiration, and Eleanor felt a surge of hope. Maybe acceptance started small. With a child's question, Matthew stood by her side through every trial. His steady support, a balm to her fears. "Love isn't about perfection," he said one evening as they walked through the fading light. "It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's hard." Eleanor nodded. "I'm choosing you. All of you, and all of me." Their bond deepened, fortified by honesty and courage. The wedding day dawned bright and clear. The town gathered in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. Friends and neighbors, once strangers, now stood as witnesses to a love that had defied expectations. Eleanor wore a simple white dress, her hair braided with wildflowers. Matthew looked every bit the rugged lumberjack she had come to love. As they exchanged vows beneath the open sky, Eleanor felt a profound peace. She was chosen, she was seen, and she was loved for all that she was. The journey ahead was unknown, but together, they would face whatever came. Because in Bear Ridge, Eleanor had found not just a home, but a heart. The seasons turned again in Bear Ridge, painting the world with the fiery reds and golds of autumn. Eleanor and Matthew's cabin stood sturdy against the crisp air, smoke curling from the chimney and the scent of pine filling the room. Life had settled into a comfortable, joyful rhythm. Eleanor awoke one morning with a sense of quiet excitement. Today was different. She was no longer the woman who had arrived on the train uncertain, rejected, and hoping. Now, she was a wife, part of a community, a partner to a man who saw her true worth. The townsfolk were bustling with preparations for the annual harvest festival. Stalls were being set up, lanterns hung from trees, and the scent of baking pies drifted on the breeze. Matthew and Eleanor worked side by side, carrying bundles of firewood and decorating the square with wreaths of pine and berries. "Look at you," Matthew said, brushing a stray curl from Eleanor's face. "You fit in here like you were born for it." She smiled. "I never thought I would." Matthew pulled her close. "You were made for this, and for me." As evening fell, the festival came alive. Laughter, music, and dancing filled the air beneath a canopy of stars. Children ran through the square, their faces painted and their voices ringing with joy. Eleanor caught sight of Mrs. Weatherby, who smiled warmly, her eyes shining with pride. Matthew led Eleanor to the center of the celebration, where a circle of friends and neighbors gathered. With quiet confidence, he raised his voice. "To Eleanor," he said, "who came to Bear Ridge, not just to find a husband, but to find herself. She showed us all that strength and beauty come in many forms. And she taught me what it means to truly see someone." A cheer rose up from the crowd. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, tears of gratitude, love, and belonging. Later that night, as the festival fires died down, Eleanor and Matthew stood hand in hand beneath the tall pines. The world was vast and wild, but here, in this small corner, they had carved out something lasting. "Whatever comes next," Eleanor whispered, "I'm ready." Matthew kissed her forehead. "Me too." Together, they stepped forward into their new life, a life built not on appearances, but on love, respect, and the courage to be exactly who they were meant to be.